Hello and welcome to another video from Let's Excel at Finance. Today we're going to talk about an advanced formula called DSum, which will help us get away from having to do lots of manual filtering, lots of clicks and drop downs, filtering with text to try and get to data from a data range or a table. So let's go and have a look at our example and talk about our scenario. So the scenario here is I've got a data set that I got for GRNI, goods received not invoiced. Now I've only got a sample here just for today's example, but just imagine this is hundreds of thousands of rows of data, and you may be able to relate to this scenario where you've got a data set. This is formatted as a table. We can tell that because we've got the colorings here and we've got the filters on the top and we have the table design appear on the top of the ribbon. But we're going to apply the filters, which you can do from the data tab and clicking on the filter. And you might say that this is a typical scenario where you might come in here and click on a supplier and then start to look at groupings of detail to try and find balances based upon questions that you have. So in this case, for this supplier, I've got GRNI that's in the 60 to 90 day bucket that is on the 952,000 range. And then if I want to go and look at another data set, another range, I would have to go back in here and do an awful lot of clicking. This now says this is nearly 1.1 million, etc. Right? Lots and lots of clicking, not very dynamic in terms of being able to quickly shift between different things and filtering them. So what we're going to try and do is get away from doing all these different filters and be a bit more dynamic with the way that we're thinking about aggregating the data onto the front of our Excel file, and then we can link that into other dashboards and things that we can build in our Excel file. So let's start with looking up at our DSum syntax, and then we'll talk a bit more about how we structure this data set. So DSum. So the DSum is essentially database and the sum function combined into one. So our first parameter in this formula is the data source, the database. Now in this example we're going to use a table. So it's our blue table over here that we're going to use. This could also be a range of cells, but we're going to use our database as the format. Now notice that when I select the range here, we get the table one and all because we've selected the entire table. I should really rename the table here to something a bit more meaningful, but for today's example we'll leave it as is. The second parameter is it's asking for which field of that table do we want to use to aggregate. Again, we're doing a sum, so we're going to tell it which field in the database, which is our first column. Those are the fields. Sorry, our first row I should say. These are the fields, and what we want to do is tell it which one we want to aggregate. Now we can choose any of these, but obviously it has to be a numerical number for us to aggregate. And so I want to use the GRNI dollar amount. Now a word of warning here, you can type in quotes the field header name, but this is not very forgiving for spelling mistakes, transpositions, extra spaces, things like that. So I generally recommend that you click the cell for the header. That avoids then any issues, and if you rename the header or the next time you paste data in from your source, if that changes, if there's an extra space or someone made a typing change, then it will update into your formula. The third parameter is then the criteria we're going to use to filter the data. So we need to tell it which of the fields and then what's the value in those fields that we want to filter. So I've got this little table here set up. It's actually a group of cells. Notice that in the reference here, we've got the two cell references for the range. And what this is essentially going to tell the formula is it's going to say, look in that data table. So look in this table over here. Aggregate the data in this column based on what you filter here. Now these two cells underneath here are going to be our criteria. That's going to be the values that is applied to the filter in the formula, and then it will result the sum of what's in the GRNI dollar column. Currently they're blank. So when we press enter here, we get a value. What is that value? Well, that value is the entire data set, the sum of the GRNI column. We've just said, go to the table, grab all the data, sum the GRNI column and apply no filters to it. So of course it gives us all of the data. Now these two cells here are drop downs from our data validation list. So we've just taken a unique list of the supplier and the unique list of the aging groups, and that's what we have showing here. Now we can now click on capital 1. So now we're filtering this range on capital 1. Notice we're not looking at any aging at the moment. So if I come to our data set and apply the normal way of doing filtering, there's capital 1, there's our total, 2515, 2515. Now I want to apply a different filter on the aging. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to come to here to our drop down here, which is based on this data validation here. Just a side note, if you've never done data validation before, we're going to cover that in a separate video. I'm not going to go through how to set that up today, but it's just essentially a list from the data validation, from data validation to these cells in here. So now we've got capital 1 and we've got 60 to 90 days. So let's now go ahead and do that just to check to make sure our formula is working correct. There's our 60 to 90 days. There's our capital 1. And there's our number, 952 is reconciled in both places. So hopefully you see that this is more dynamic. Now you might say, well, what happens if I want to add an additional column? Maybe I want to be able to search on specific POs. Well, that's very simple. All you need to do is take your PO. I'm going to take my PO and my format here just for an example. And I'm just going to paste these in here. And then I'm going to change my criteria to include the column L. So now I'm including in my criteria, I've now got this additional column. Now when I come in and I want to search, I can search for, so this is this supplier here. So I'm going to search for this supplier and they have a 0 to 30 days. So my 0 to 30 days, and now there's my balance that comes in here. So I can now choose any of these. I can take this out and I can put a different PO number. So let me just put this one in here, or copy this, paste this in here, and now it filters on just the PO. So it's very, very versatile, right? I can say, you know, if I want to look at what's the total amount for my 90 to 120 days, there's 2.168 there. Very, very versatile. Now, because I used a table over here, what I can also do is when I bring in new data, so let's say this is outstanding GRNI and I get to the new month and I've now got new data that I want to bring in. So I'm just going to now take this data and I'm going to cut this and move it up. A couple of things, if you've not done anything with tables before, notice that as soon as I put that data next to an existing table, the format drops down, this little kind of handle here at the bottom of the table also moved down. And now our numbers have updated. Why? Because now when we look at the cell range is now including the entire table. So all that new data, didn't have to adjust anything on the filters. And so now I can start to use this. Now you'll notice a couple of things. My data validation list has got bigger. It's got more suppliers in it because there's more suppliers in the newer data set. I added 5 new suppliers. That updated automatically. And that's using some new functionality in new Excel, which I'll cover in a future video. This has also included a new aging group. We've now got 120 plus that wasn't showing before. This is so with some data from the older vendors which have got some older records in here. So there's 120 days plus old here. So we'll talk about these extra ranges and how this can make this dynamic for you in a future video, or if you want to send me a message on Twitter, I will send you some instructions and some links on how to do those items. So hopefully this is very helpful to you. Hopefully you're understanding how we can maybe use this in a scenario in your work. I want to just take you quickly just to a slightly different way of looking at this, a slightly more advanced way of doing this type of exercise. So in this scenario, I want to draw your attention to the 2.5% here. Let's suggest that this is our target. We have a target of 2.5% for our age GRNI where it's 120 days or more. So over here, what I've got is, I'm just going to bring it over into the view, is I've got a bit of a format here, and I'm using some icons here that we're going to be able to choose our vendor based upon 120 days to see whether or not we have got the balance of our total annual spend for these vendors is greater or less than our target of 2.5%. So here we've got our vendors that have got balances of 120 days. So these are our really aged GRNI balances. And these are our total annual spend. So I'm doing the current GRNI that's in this table over here that we looked at earlier for the 120 plus days. And I'm comparing that with the annual spend that we're planning with that supplier. And that will give us a percentage of how much of that GRNI is aged. You know, we're going to be put on stop by that supplier because we haven't paid really aged invoices. And this just is a fun way. It gives us based upon the score. So if the number here is above the target, then it's going to show us this cloud, rainy cloud. If it's below, then it's going to show us fireworks and a happy day that we're below our target here, just as a silly example. I also have some text here which we can use then to use in emails or communications, which has the supplier, has the name of the supplier, the GRNI with the number of days, and then the balance, the amount that we're capturing here, and also the percentage, just as a string of text in here that we're just grouping together. And so we can grab this and put this into an email, into a PowerPoint slide deck, etc. And you'll notice that as I change this drop down here, it's going to change this text, it's going to change this formula, it's going to do our lookup to here. This will change obviously as we just did in our example, and then our icon's going to change as well. So let me go through a couple of these examples and we'll show you how this works. So we're on Pioneer currently. We're going to go to Transworld and we click there and we see that we get an update, and we'll click here onto the TransUnion intermediate holdings. We notice that the amount now has gone below the 2.5, so now we've got a different icon. We've got the fireworks. Notice that the TransUnion got updated in our text. Let's go ahead and do one more example where we had the 1.9%, the 400,000 here, and that updated, and then we'll come back to our last one where we go back to a rainy cloud being the 3.7 versus our 2.5%. So there's some just creative ways for us to use some other functions, some other other functionality that we've used and talked about in other videos. Hopefully this is helpful to you and giving you some ideas on how you could use some of these tips and tricks in your day-to-day work. This brings us to the end of the video. Again, I want to thank you as always for taking the time to watch these videos. It would be great if you would subscribe and follow, like this video. If you have questions or want to hit us up on Twitter, then please reach out to us on the Twitter handle as you can see on the screen. Thank you, and we'll look forward to talking to you again on the next video.